Welcome back, guys. We are on to topic 6.3, Westward Expansion, Social and Cultural Development, which is kind of a vague title. Basically, what we're going to be looking at in this particular section is the effect of westward expansion on Native Americans. So the so-called Indian Wars, we're going to look at those and try to figure out, kind of causes and effects of those conflicts. So our guiding question in 6.3 is, what were the causes and effects of the settlement of the West from 1877 to 1898? And let's begin by looking at Native Americans. So I want you to think back to last semester when we were looking at Andrew Jackson and his so-called Indian removal policies. If you recall, his goal was to not only make to make room for white settlement of former Indian lands, but it was also an attempt to try to move Indians further west where they would not be wiped out. They would get a chance to kind of develop and be preserved. Well, as we get into, right about the Civil War era, we've got about 360,000 or so Native Americans, many of whom are living on what we might call the Great Plains, these huge grasslands between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River. And as Western settlers move further and further west, of course, white settlers are going to see Native Americans as basically an obstacle, as something that has to be dealt with if we're going to open these lands up to white settlement. So let's think about these settlers and soldiers as they head out onto the plains and look at the effects. And one of the effects of this migration would be that the intertribal conflicts which had existed way before white settlers ever arrived, they're going to be intensified. And what I mean by that is different Native American groups fought amongst themselves, and with the land they have access to shrinking because of the arrival of soldiers and settlers, those conflicts then become even more heated as they're trying to do whatever they can do to kind of hold on to their land. These soldiers and settlers are also going to bring disease and intensify, already the struggles and difficulties of the Native Americans on the plains. And the buffalo herds or bison herds are going to be hunted nearly to extinction. And this was to make room for the railroads, to make room for grazing, for food for the settlers and travelers. But of course, the buffalo was something that the Native Americans of the plains relied heavily on. And you can see what I'm talking about. But when I say they've been decimated, this is a pile of buffalo skulls and bones here. And they're going to be ground into fertilizer. That's the plan for those. So the bison, as I said, were hunted or killed almost to extinction. By 1885, we estimate there were less than 1,000 left. To give you some idea, there had been tens of millions of bison, and they weren't just on the Great Plains. They had extended all the way basically to the Appalachians, and historically speaking. But by 1885 rather, there's only about 1,000 left. So basically all the bison you see today, if you ever see them in film or in real life, they're all descendants of that few that were saved. Speaking of buffalo or bison, some of the soldiers who fought on the plains were not white. They were black units of soldiers on the plains, and they were known as buffalo soldiers. That was the name that the Indians gave to these soldiers. All right, now let's talk about a treaty. Now, we've looked at several treaties already this year between Native Americans and the federal government, and this one's a pretty important one. It's called the Fort Laramie Treaty from 1851. And this is kind of where the modern reservation system begins. And what that means is, with this treaty, boundaries were drawn on a map. It basically said, Indians have this land, but they need to stay on that land, almost as if you were carving up the land into, states or colonies or something. The Indians also had agreed to let white settlers pass through safely. But there are some built-in problems to this system of drawing lines in a map and saying, okay, you have to, Crow Indians, you have to stay right here. And Arapaho and Cheyenne, you got to stay right there. And this is something that really didn't make any sense to the Native Americans. It went so against their traditions and their history that the idea of being kind of walled in is just not gonna work very well. We'll say that much. All right, this brings us then to the Indian Wars. Now, the Indian Wars really are, I mean, you could trace this all the way back to colonial times, right? King Philip's War and all that, Powhatan Wars and whatever. But when we say the Indian Wars, it really refers to basically the second half of the 1800s, from the Civil War until the close of the century. That's the so-called Indian Wars that you see of, like a lot of movies and things like that. So we don't have time to look at all the battles and all the conflicts. We're going to look at 3 of these. And the first one is called the Sand Creek Massacre. This took place in modern-day southeastern Colorado. And 1864, of course, for some context, that's right in the Civil War. And a militia was called out to subdue Native Americans who were not on the land that I guess the Colorado government thought they should be on. And this militia was led by Colonel J.M. Chivington. And Chivington approached this encampment. You can see the painting there. And what he saw, in his eyes, what he saw was like this, army that's ready to attack. But in reality, what this was is just a kind of a settlement of men, women, and children. The Indians, even if you can see the detail here, even were flying the U.S. flag as kind of a sign that, hey, we're not a threat to you. We don't want to be bothered. And the Colorado militia attacked, and it was absolutely brutal, killing men, women, children, just butchering the Native Americans, many of whom were unarmed. Just a really dark moment. And the quote from Colonel Chivington, I think, really kind of gets you into his mindset, like what his motivations were. The quote here, you can see at the bottom of your screen, it says, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice." In other words, nits make lice. That's a reference to it's okay to kill Indian children because if you don't, they'll grow into Indian adults, and that's not good. So that was his mindset, okay? I mean, again, this is something that's hard for us to understand, but that was the mindset he brought, and obviously there were a lot of people who agreed with him. And so as we look at the Indian Wars on the plains, they tend to be extremely violent, just really almost genocidal in their nature. It's very brutal stuff. Okay, our next conflict is going to involve a guy who was a Civil War veteran, Colonel George Armstrong Custer, who I might note graduated last in his class at West Point, just saying. Now, the trigger here is in 1874, his soldiers, they go into the Black Hills region of what is today South Dakota. And this was part of the Great Sioux Reservation. And while Custer soldiers are there, there's an announcement that gold has been discovered in the Black Hills. Well, you know what's going to happen next. Everybody and their brother is going to come out of the woodworks and pour onto Sioux lands looking for that gold. And the Sioux obviously felt this was a violation of their treaty. They were upset about this. Some of the Sioux leave the reservation. And so what happens is in 1876, Custer and the 7th Cavalry is sent out to try to suppress the Sioux, and put them back on their Great Sioux Reservation. And this is going to culminate in the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is one of the, in terms of tactical blunders, I can't even say it. This one's a big one. I mean, Custer is going to make a major mistake because when he attacks the Indians he finds, first of all, he doesn't wait for reinforcements. This was supposed to be a 3-pronged assault, and Custer is so anxious to get in there, and he's so overconfident, he doesn't wait for the other soldiers to get there. So his force of less than 300 soldiers is going to attack what turns out to be an Indian force of about 2,500 soldiers. And this obviously is not going to go well for Custer and his soldiers. And what the Battle of Little Bighorn is most famous for is the fact that it wasn't just a defeat of the American cavalry. It was an absolute wipeout. Not a single survivor in Custer's soldiers here happened to walk away from this battle. They were all killed right here at the Battle of Little Bighorn. All right, so the very next year we have another conflict we're going to look at. This is going to involve the Nez Perce, which were basically from eastern Oregon. And the leader of one of these bands of the Nez Perce was named Chief Joseph. And he decides that he is not going to live on a reservation. Okay, we're not going to stay here. We're going to, move freely because that's the way we've always done things. We're not going to change it now. And so he leaves the reservation with some of his followers. And this turns into kind of a long road, like a long pursuit of the Nez Perce. So the federal forces are on their heels. Nez Perce are trying to escape. Their goal is to ultimately get to Canada, because once they get outside the United States, they're not going to be chased by the U.S. cavalry any longer. But this does not work. They are defeated and captured, and Chief Joseph, when he surrendered, famously said, "Hear me, my chiefs, I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." And the Nez Perce are then transported to Kansas, to a lonely, dusty reservation where about 40% of the survivors would die of disease. So let's talk a little bit more about the reservation system and how it kind of evolves over time. And this is going to bring us to a very important law. It's called the Dawes Severalty Act, but we know it in shorthand as simply the Dawes Act of 1887. And what the Dawes Act does is it really changes the relationship between the federal government and Native Americans. So gone are the days of recognizing tribal ownership of land. That is to say, in the past, the federal government had basically recognized the claim of land as the tribe owning that land collectively. There's no single owner. And that didn't really fit in with what the vision was of what Native Americans should become. The vision was that the Native Americans would eventually settle down, they'll become independent farmers, and they'll fit into the capitalist system of America. And so we're not going to recognize tribal ownership. Instead, land is going to be divided up into individual plots, about 160 acres, given to each Native American family. Now, that doesn't sound necessarily bad up front, but the reality is, out of desperation, what's going to happen is some of these Native Americans are going to sell off their portion of land, because now it's owned individually. They could do that, and so the reservations are going to start to kind of shrink as that land is sold off. And this was, of course, very concerning to Native Americans because they already lost a lot of land. Now they're losing even more land. Another component of this is the Dawes Severalty Act would promise citizenship to Native Americans in 25 years. That does not actually come to fruition. Not all Native Americans are going to gain citizenship until the 1920s, so quite a way off. And you can see this cartoon again. We're going to take your land and we're going to divide it into plots, and you get your own little plot. And if you sell it off, well, we know what's going to happen to the reservation. It's going to start shrinking. Now, another part of this Dawes Act and kind of just the federal policy from this era was setting aside money to, this is the term they would have used, civilize the Native Americans. Okay, in other words, teach them English, attempt to convert them to Christianity, have them wear American-style clothing, farm like an American, basically kind of undo their Native American. There was a phrase that some people used, which is very offensive, but the phrase was kill the Indian and save the man. In other words, if we can strip Native Americans of their cultural identity and have them adopt the dominant American identity, then that'll benefit them and America as a whole, because they'll start to kind of assimilate and blend in. And so there were these so-called Indian schools that were established, in Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania was probably the most famous of these, where Indian children were, they were removed from the reservation. They went to these schools, and there they were basically taught to become Americans and not Indians any longer. All right, so if the Native Americans can't win on the battlefield, there's still an option of holding on to their culture, right? They can still resist by holding on to their culture. And this brings us to something called the ghost dance. And this is a kind of a religious movement of sorts that begins in 1890. And the people who practiced the ghost dance prophesied that basically if Native Americans did this particular dance, then what would happen is unity and peace among Native Americans would return. And not just that, the lands they had lost would return, that buffalo would return, and white settlers would basically just be defeated and removed. So in other words, what the ghost dance is basically saying is if we do this particular dance, then we'll turn back the tide of history, it will turn back the hands of time, and it'll be just like before the whites ever got to the West. Now, this is, of course, something that the federal government was not interested in allowing to happen. They saw this as a threat because this could encourage Native Americans to resist. And to stamp this out, federal forces moved in southern, what we call South Dakota today. And there, this results in what's known as the Battle of Wounded Knee, or the Massacre of Wounded Knee would be a better description. Now, what sets this off is somewhat debated. One common trigger that you hear a lot in history books is that as the federal forces were disarming these Sioux people, that one of the warriors, because he was perhaps hard of hearing, would not give up his gun. And there was kind of a struggle over the gun. And then that triggered violence. And then these soldiers basically just opened up on the Sioux. Again, most of these people were unarmed, women and children. And over 200 Sioux are going to be killed. And about 24 federal troops killed. I'm sure some of them actually probably from friendly fire. They accidentally shot their own soldiers in the chaos of battle. And this is a really dark moment because it sort of symbolizes all that was difficult about life for Native Americans in the West. That they're always outgunned, always outnumbered. They're always at disadvantage, and they just can't seem to, catch a break. And this is a really sad moment. The idea of Native Americans being piled into mass graves, it's really a sad moment. And this also, by the way, is basically the end of the Indian Wars. There will be a few skirmishes here and there, but this is kind of the last straw. The Native Americans have been basically broken, militarily speaking anyways, and from here on out, the reservation will be the future for Native Americans. All right, last thing we're looking at is a census, or at least the results of a census, as we talk about the fading frontier. Now, as a quick note, guys, for those of us who are watching this in 2021, I forgot to put this particular section on the notes. So sorry about that. You're probably wondering where the heading is in your notes for this, and I just forgot to put it in there. So my mistake. All right, so 1890. There is a census. Like every 10 years, we have a census, and at this census, we came to the conclusion, after looking at the data and everything, that something has happened. Something that has never happened in American history up to this point. We didn't have a frontier anymore. Okay, and that's not to say every single place in America was settled, of course, but even areas that were unsettled were broken up by settled territory. So think back to the earliest days of American history, Jamestown and Plymouth and all that. There was always this wide open frontier. You could always go west and find land that hadn't yet been settled. And now that's not really the case. There is no real frontier left by 1890. Now, the realization of that change in American history was a little shocking. And a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner prepared a speech, and it's called the Turner thesis or the Frontier thesis, and this was published in 1893. And in this thesis, what he does is he basically describes that the frontier is what gave America its unique character. It had made Americans more democratic, more egalitarian, in other words, more equality-based, that had made them self-sufficient and individualistic and caring for others because, out on the frontier, you're relying on yourself, yes, but you're also relying on your neighbors, and everyone has a chance to go out west and make a go of it. And so the frontier was, in other words, in his mind, a key ingredient in what made America America. And without a frontier, the big question, of course, is, well, what happens to the American character going forward? What happens now that we don't have a frontier? And we're going to come back and revisit this idea a little bit later when we talk about imperialism, the idea of maybe finding a new frontier, but just a frontier that's overseas. All right, guys, I know that was a lot of information in 6.3, but we covered a lot of stuff there on causes and effects of the settlement of the West. We looked at the Indian Wars, we looked at the Ghost Dance, the Dawes Act, and the Frontier Thesis. So make sure you look over those topics, and we'll continue in Period 6 in the next video.